John Ghazvinian, you are an Iranian-American journalist and historian and the executive director of the Middle East Center at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. And today we're going to talk about your latest book, American and Iran, A History 1720 to the Present. John, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me on your program.
So, John, there is practically not a week going by without we having some news about the relationship with Iran, the U.S. This one says one thing, and then the other one retaliates by saying the other thing, and it's like a never-ending story. But in your book, you tell us that it hasn't always been that way. That at one time there was a nice friendship, even admiration for each other's policies and government systems. So. First of all, before we get to the book, I wonder if you could tell us just a brief history of you. Who are you? Where do you come from? Why are you interested in journalism? And why in particular Middle Eastern journalism?
Yeah, sure. So I was actually born in Iran. I was 1 year old when my family left Iran. I grew up in England, just outside London. In high school, came to Los Angeles, and then to the East Coast, and then went back to the UK for my graduate school, and became a historian and a journalist. I obviously interested in the subject for my own kind of background and heritage, but also I love history. And my first book was about Africa, and I was working as a journalist for Newsweek in London, and at the time, and other publications as well. I mean, I was sort of a freelancer. And I wanted to write about Iran, and I didn't know exactly what to do. And I thought, well, I have this training as a historian, so I'd like to tell the whole history of US-Iran relations. But it wasn't the first time it's ever been done, and I wanted to bring something fresh and different to it. And that really relates to what you said at the beginning, which is that it seems like always something is going on. There's always in the news, there's always all this hostility. So the historian, you want to take that back and see, where it comes from. But actually what I realized is that in some ways that was the wrong question to ask. Is not, as a historian, it's not my job to just figure out how things got so bad, because there's also another question there that's implied, which is if things got so bad, then maybe there was some point when they weren't so bad. So that is also part of the story. And let's talk about that. Let's try to explain that. And as I kept looking more at that, I realized no one had really written very much about that, and how far back it went. No one had really done histories of US-Iran relations that went back much before 1940. And that was because they were using American archives if they were American historians, and the US is not very interested in other parts of the world outside the Americas, basically, before 1940. So there's this feeling that, it doesn't matter. The history doesn't matter before. Well, it actually very much matters. It doesn't just matter because the US is interested. Iran was very interested for 100 years before that in developing a closer relation with the United States. So that's what I wanted to explore a little bit more, and that was kind of the gist of the book.
Just one personal question. So you were born in Iran, and although you have spent a great deal of your life in the United States, I wonder if you have ever been victim of discrimination, because there is a history in the United States to discriminate against the people whose origins, like for example, when the United States was having a war against Japan, Japanese were discriminated. Now that we have the coronavirus, people are discriminating against Chinese. So in the context of having this tension against Iran, have you personally been discriminated in any way?
Well, I'm very fortunate. I've had a good life. I wouldn't say that I don't want to tell a sort of story of victimhood. That's not really, I think there are people who, short answers, yes, sure, but I don't want to. I think there are people who have had to deal with much worse. I think really, I think that in our own time, every time period in history looks a bit different. We don't have concentration camps, or I should say, let me rephrase that. We don't have internment camps like we had with Japanese during the Second World War. But we do have a Muslim ban. We have a travel ban, whatever you want to call it, that overwhelmingly targets certain countries, and actually overwhelmingly targets Iran. and Iranian Americans, because that is far and away. You look at the countries on that list, for the most part, at least initially, you know, they were not countries where you had huge numbers of people coming back and forth, but you had very large numbers of people coming back and forth between Iran and the United States, and that was really, you know, cut off. And that's affected everybody who's Iranian and who has extended family in Iran.
Well, I'm from Colombia, South America, and at the time period when there was the war on drugs, I couldn't get into a U.S. airport without being stripped down and searched. And well, at that time, I did feel that I was being discriminated against, but I mean, nothing other than just being pat down and sometimes taking off my clothes, but I didn't, you know, compare with things going on in the world. That's nothing. So I get your point. Okay, so what inspired you to write this book? I mean, you are Iranian, you are a historian, but was there a trigger point that you say, "Wow, this is the next book I'm going to write"?
Yeah, my first book was about Africa. As I said, it was called Untapped: The Scramble for Africa's Oil. In fact, I have a few copies of it still behind me many years later. That came out in 2007. You know, like I said, I was trained as a historian, but I didn't really want to. I never pursued an academic historian's kind of path, career path. I was more interested in communicating and writing for larger audiences. So that's why I went into journalism for a while, and I did the Africa book. And I think there was never really a trigger point. There was never a moment. But I think it was, look, initially when I studied history, I studied British history. And then I did journalism, I did Western European stories, I did, you know, Africa. I never really wanted to deal with the Middle East or Iran, but I think gradually it finds you, and you find it hard to, I think, avoid kind of who you are and where you fit into these kinds of stories, even if it's unconsciously or subtly. And especially after September 11th, 2001, I think like a lot of people who are Middle Eastern, I began to take more interest in understanding that part of the world. I think a lot of us who are of Middle Eastern heritage, if we're really honest with ourselves, it doesn't mean that we automatically are experts on the Middle East. But after September 11th, you know, you feel like you're in the spotlight somehow, and people want you to explain things or talk about things, and you feel actually like you want to learn more yourself, actually, before you do that. So I think that's probably where it began in some ways, but it's been a gradual.
Okay, well, you divide your book in four sections. Number one, the spring of mutual fascination. Then section number two, the summer of early interaction. Then autumn of close strategic ties. And finally, the long dark winter of mutual hatred. I wonder if you could just describe shortly for the podcast which one, first of all, yeah, in the spring, that area of mutual fascination. I mean, the Persian, let's call them Persia for this time period, have a long history and culture. Why would they have any kind of fascination toward this new country called the United States?
No, great question. I mean, yeah, so this spring, the first section of the book, you know, I really wanted to start not just with the whole history, but I even wanted to do the prehistory, the preconceived notions that people have. You know, when you meet somebody for the first time, you know, what do you think about them before you even meet them, right? What are the stereotypes and the mental kind of baggage that both civilizations are bringing to this, even before they have any contact? That was fascinating. I mean, to see that Americans, colonial American newspapers in the 1720s were fascinated by Iran, by Persia, as they called it, were very pro-Iranian, saw it as the lesser of two evils in the Middle East, less evil than the Ottoman Empire, which they saw as more Muslim somehow. There was a lot of that kind of, you know, really interesting kind of stuff. And I called the opening chapter East of Eden. And the Iranians had the same version. You asked, you know, why would they be interested in a country so far away? And you're right. Initially, in the 18th century, they didn't really think very much about America. They called it the Yengi Donya, the New World. You know, and they just thought it was this wild kind of place, you know. It wasn't until the late 19th century, mid to late 19th century, 1850s, 60s, 70s, that Iran became interested in the US. And the reason for that was because they were tired of dealing with the Europeans, with the Russians and the British especially, who were really kind of suffocating them in a lot of ways and interfering in their affairs. And they liked the US because they saw the US as an anti-imperial. I know this may be hard for us to, you know, kind of think about today, but in the mid 19th century, they really saw the U.S. as this anti-imperial power, a country that had come to power in a revolution against the British Empire, that didn't seem to want to interfere in other countries' affairs. Obviously, Latin America has an interesting history with this right around the same time, actually, which is a little bit different. But from the place where the Iranians were coming from, they liked that the U.S. seemed very hands-off, and so this made them more and more appealing. And so this is before there's any really much in the way of actual contact. So that's the spring, and I talk about this kind of mutual admiration, mutual fascination, and some of the early contacts that they had and how that played out.
And what was some of the things that the U.S. admire about Iran at this time?
Well, so they have this. No, it's funny. They didn't know a lot about Iran,
Right.
but what they knew about it, they knew from the Bible.
Okay.
And in the Bible, Iran or Persia, it comes out very, very positively. Cyrus the Great frees the Jews from the Babylonian captivity. You have the three wise men, the Magi from the east. Those are Iranians, probably. There's a lot of positive things to associate with Iran. They also knew about the Persian Empire, the ancient Persian Empire, the one that had fought with the Greeks. And if you remember your ancient history, the Greeks, even though they were enemies of the Persians, they really admired the Persians. Herodotus really wrote very admiringly of the Persians. In fact, if you're in New York City and you go to the Central Post Office, there's a motto that's chiseled above the columns in stone, the Central Post Office near Madison Square Garden. And it says, it's famous post office, US post office motto that says, "Neither snow nor rain nor sleet nor gloom of night shall stay these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds." That's a quote from Herodotus about the ancient Persian Empire's postal service, which was the world's first great postal service. He really admired the fact that this huge empire, you were able to get a letter from one end of the empire to the other in 1 week. And he wrote about that. And then the US Postal Service used that as their motto. So a lot of people don't realize that is their unofficial motto. A lot of people don't realize this when they see that. It's a very famous post office motto, but it's actually a reference to Iran, So it's stuff like that. They really admired this kind of ancient Persian heritage. Benjamin Franklin said we should emulate the ancient Persians. They put so much emphasis on their education and so on. So there were all these different reasons, but also political. It was the enemy of my enemy is my friend. They didn't like the Ottoman Empire because of this long history of crusades and feeling threatened, Europeans feeling threatened by the Ottomans. But they knew that the Ottomans were rivals of the Persians. So they thought, the Persians are somehow they're harmless. They're up there far in the east. They're this kind of exotic oriental kingdom. And I think a lot of this mental baggage stays with Americans right up until the 1970s, actually.
Wow. Okay. And can we move on then to summer early interactions? What is it that brought these two countries together? In it was a commerce, politics.
Yeah, it's interesting. This is actually, I think, a really fascinating period of U.S.-Iran history that people don't write very much about. It's the kind of, I think if you're looking for a kind of golden age of U.S.-Iran relations, this might be it. It's the early 20th century, 1910s, 20s, 30s, 40s, where they hadn't yet become close strategic allies. That's autumn. But the initial, they were getting beyond just the initial fascination. In fact, the Iranian ambassador to the US in 1922, 23, Hossein Allah, he went on a speaking tour all over the US, and he said, it's time for us to get beyond cats and carpets, which is a great line that he used, right? Because the Americans at the time, when they thought of Persia, they just thought of Persian cats and Persian carpets. And he said, let's get beyond that. Let's get beyond some of these initial ideas we have, and let's start to build a friendship. And they did build a friendship in some really interesting ways. There was an American financial advisor, Morgan Schuster, who went to Iran and reorganized Iran's finances and became a hero to Iranians and a celebrity in the US. There was all kinds of stuff. I mean, the US helped Iran build a railway across its country in the late 1920s. But there was also blips, like from 1936 to 39, the two countries basically broke off their relations for 3 years over a speeding ticket that was given to the Iranian ambassador in the US when his chauffeur was driving too fast in Elkton, Maryland, in a small town in Maryland. And it created a huge conflict between the two countries for 3 years. So, there's all kinds of interesting stuff in there.
Okay, and then how did they become strategic partners I guess that must be in politics, I assume.
Yes, that's the autumn. That is after the 1953 coup in Iran. As many of your listeners will know, in 1953, the CIA sponsored a coup against the Iranian government, against the very popular Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, who had nationalized the oil industry in Iran. After that, the Shah, the king, became a very close strategic ally of the United States, a very important Cold War partner. The Shah was very anti-communist, anti-Soviet. He was more of a conservative, pro-Western monarch. And this was a very close and very important relationship. But unfortunately, the Shah also gradually drifted more and more towards dictatorship. And by the 1970s, he was buying huge amounts of weapons from the United States. I mean, spectacular amounts of military equipment, but also had one of the most ruthless and brutal secret police apparatus in the world, and torture and so on. It was a police state, a military state. And he became very unpopular, and there was a revolution in 1979, and of course that's where things changed completely.
Okay, and then we, well, first of all, we got the CIA meddling in the politics of other countries. That's always, they also meddle in the politics of my own country as well. They created the separation of Colombia and Panama, but that's another story. So then, when is this hatred begins? When the Americans start hating the Iranians and the Iranians the Americans?
Yeah, I mean, there are two big dates, right? For Iranians, 1953 is a very important date because that's when they first become really disillusioned and disappointed with the United States, is when the CIA overthrows the government. But there's still, the government in Iran is still very close and it's very supportive of the US, even though the population is becoming more and more frustrated with the US. After 1979, everything changes. That is the big date for Americans because there was a revolution in Iran. It deposes the Shah from power. The Ayatollah Khomeini comes to power, bringing with it a kind of Islamic or Islamist kind of government that is much less friendly to the US. Initially, there is some possibility of friendliness, but unfortunately, there is a really catastrophic decision that is taken by the US in November or end of October of 1979, which is to admit the former Shah of Iran into the US for medical treatment. Because of the experience that Iranian revolutionaries had 25 years earlier with the CIA, they were afraid that the US was plotting another coup to bring the Shah back to power again. So these protesters and students, radicalized students, they stormed the US embassy in Tehran. They took its employees hostage. It was supposed to be just a few days, but it ended up being over a year. It was this big standoff between the two countries. The US broke off relations with Iran in April of 1980. The hostages were eventually released in January of 1981, but of course the relations between the two countries have never been reestablished. It's been one thing after another since then. This is a long, dark winter of mutual hatred.
Wow. Okay. And those relationships didn't get any better under Donald Trump. I wonder if you have any idea of how they will continue now under the new administration of the United States.
Yeah, I mean, as a historian, predictions are always a bit uncomfortable terrain for me. I prefer to stay in the past and not even the present, let alone the future. But I think that there are some reasons for being hopeful. The current president and foreign minister of Iran, who are more pragmatic, reform-minded, they are not going to be, or the president is not going to be president after June. There's an election in June in Iran. Iran's president, just like the American president, is limited to 2 terms of 4 years each, and he's at the end of his second term. So he only has a couple more months in office. But the interesting thing is that the JCPOA, the nuclear deal that was signed in 2015, was kind of the big signature landmark foreign policy achievement of that administration. So they want to resurrect it before they go, because right now the more hardline, more anti-American elements in Iran have a very strong argument. They can say, because Trump pulled out of the nuclear deal, they can say, you see, we told you, you can't trust America. And so they're very, very likely to win the election in June. They have a very strong case. Right now, you're not going to win an election in Iran on a platform of better relations with the US. Rouhani and Zarif have been humiliated by the withdrawal of the US, from the JCPOA. So they really want to get back into it so they can resurrect their legacy, save their legacy, and prevent the hardliners, the conservatives, and the sort of anti-Americans from winning the election in June. Same thing in Washington. The new Biden administration, a lot of these people actually personally were involved in negotiating the nuclear deal in the Obama administration. They have a stake too. They're invested in this and they believe in it. So I think the two, and they've worked together. Some of these people, they have each other's cell phone numbers. They've worked on this deal together. I think they want to do it, but of course, time is very limited. You know, with an election in June, the campaign is going to begin probably in another month or 6 weeks in Iran, and you know, they really have to move quickly on this. And of course, you have big important American allies like Israel and Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, who are not really big fans of improved relations between Iran and the U.S., and they're going to be making life complicated as well for Joe Biden. And on top of everything else, Biden does have a few other things on his plate. So, you know, it's challenging, but there are also some reasons for optimism.
Right. So this is out of the scope of your book, but in addition to economic and politics disagreement, there is also a cultural war, U.S. versus Iran. I mean, U.S. with the more liberal values, Iran with more conservative. I wonder what's the situation with human rights, attitude towards women. I know there is a lot of repression, but I don't really know. That's things that I hear from time to time in headlines. I wonder if you could share some of that information with us.
Yeah, you're right. It is a little bit outside the scope of my work as a historian. You know, there is plenty of repression in Iran. There are human rights issues. There are human rights issues in almost every country in the world, and I don't want to suggest that Iran it does have a poor record on human rights, but it's different. It's interesting. I mean, so do many of America's very close allies in the region, and that is not really a reason not to have better relations with Iran. It's a reason to put pressure on Iran if you do have better relations. And Iran also has its kind of human rights complaints against the United States. I mean, the government can be repressive, for sure, at times. I believe, and a lot of people don't agree with this, but I believe that the single largest human rights issue for the Iranian population as a whole is the sanctions. You know, the very, very extreme sanctions that have been placed on Iran that have suffocated its economy and caused huge suffering to 80 million people. That is also a human rights issue. You know, so I think that has to be part of the conversation as well. And too often it's a very one-sided, at least in the US. And in Iran, it's also a one-sided conversation in the other way. You know, I think that human rights, unfortunately, often gets weaponized and instrumentalized and used in a political way. And we have to be careful about that. You know, there are legitimate criticisms you can make about Iran and many other countries. But, you know, I think it's very difficult to talk about that. For me, as a historian of US-Iran relations, what I'm interested in is the relationship between these two countries. And I believe that the relations could be better, and they should be better.
Okay, so last question. So right now, there's this antagonistic relationship between the governments, but that doesn't necessarily mean the people itself have these ill feelings. I wonder what's the feeling of the 80 million Iranians towards the United States? Are they swept by this propaganda, or do they have some either admiration or desires of further friendship with the United States?
Yeah, I mean, it probably won't surprise you to hear me say that I cannot speak for 80 million Iranians, and that, of course, they have a real diversity of viewpoints. I mean, Iranians, like any other country, people have a lot of different opinions about everything, including the United States. You know, so there is a hardcore anti-American element in Iran. But I think most Iranians, the overwhelming majority, if you ask them what they think of Americans as people, they will say, we love the American people. We have problems with the foreign policy of the United States. In fact, Americans who visit Iran are always really amazed how warm the reception is and the hospitality, and just how much people are excited to see them, much more than in any other country in the Middle East, almost. You know, it's because they're not used to seeing Americans, and they really want to talk to Americans, and the government is so anti-American that they really want to, you know, get past some of these divisions. So, you know, and I think actually most Americans don't have a particularly negative viewpoint about Iranian people either. I mean, I think many do, unfortunately, but I think especially among more progressive, you know, Americans, you know, most people you talk to say, oh yeah, I have Iranian friends and whatever, you know. So, I mean, I think we, you know, on the whole, it's not as negative as the political relationship is.
Perfect. Okay, John, I have no more questions for you. I wonder if you could just tell us one more time the title of the book and where can people find you and where can people follow you as well?
Sure, thank you. I appreciate that opportunity. The book is called America and Iran, A History, 1720 to the Present. It's published by Knopf. It came out about 3 weeks ago. It is available everywhere you can buy books. And you can also find me on my website, which is johnghaz.com. That's JohnGhaz.com. And also I'm on Twitter and Instagram. So I'm happy to answer questions or engage and interact with people there as well.
John, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Alain. I really appreciate it.